My name is Grace Williams, and at 75 years old, I never thought I'd be telling this story to anyone. But here I am, sitting in this small apartment in Dallas, Texas, with my hands still trembling when I think about those 10 years that were stolen from me. It was the year 2008 when my world first began to crumble, though I didn't know it then. I was 65, recently widowed, and desperately seeking comfort in the Lord after my husband, Robert, passed from cancer. The Blessed Hope Baptist Church on Westheimer Road in Houston seemed like a sanctuary to me then. Pastor Marcus Thompson was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a voice that could make you believe angels were singing. He had this way of looking right into your soul when he preached, his dark eyes intense behind wire-rimmed glasses. The congregation was small but devoted, mostly elderly folks like myself who had nowhere else to turn after life had beaten us down. I remember the first time Pastor Thompson approached me after service. It was a humid Sunday in September, the kind of heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin even inside the air-conditioned church. "Sister Grace," he said, placing his large hand on my shoulder, "the Lord has been speaking to me about you." His voice was warm honey, and I felt chosen. Special. Little did I know I was being marked like prey. My financial situation was precarious after Robert's medical bills. Our small house on Airline Drive was mortgaged to the hilt, and my Social Security barely covered the basics. Pastor Thompson seemed to understand my struggles without me even explaining them. God provides for his faithful servants, he would say during our private counseling sessions in his wood-paneled office, surrounded by religious books and a large cross that cast shadows across his desk. The manipulation started slowly, like a gentle current that eventually becomes a riptide. Pastor Thompson began visiting my home regularly, always with a casserole from the church ladies and words of comfort. He'd sit in Robert's old recliner, his presence filling our small living room with its faded floral wallpaper and family photos. "You're all alone now, Sister Grace," he'd say, shaking his head sadly. "But God has a plan for you." By October of 2008, I was attending church 3 times a week and giving what little money I had to the collection plate. Pastor Thompson praised my devotion publicly, making me stand before the congregation while he spoke about my sacrificial giving. The other members would nod approvingly, their weathered faces reflecting my own desperate need for belonging and purpose. The first mention of the Whitmore family came during a particularly emotional service about serving others. Pastor Thompson spoke passionately about how God sometimes calls his people to serve in unexpected ways. "There's a wealthy family in River Oaks," he announced, his voice carrying across the small sanctuary, with its worn pews and stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes. "They need someone to help with household duties, someone with a servant's heart." I should have questioned why he was looking directly at me when he said those words. The River Oaks neighborhood was known throughout Houston as where the oil executives and old money families lived in their mansion-like homes behind iron gates. It seemed impossible that someone like me, a widow from a working-class background, would be considered for such a position. But Pastor Thompson made it sound like a divine appointment. "The Whitmores are God-fearing people," Pastor Thompson explained to me privately after that service. We were standing in the church parking lot under the harsh glare of streetlights, the October air finally carrying a hint of coolness. "They've specifically requested someone from our congregation, someone they can trust." His words made me feel important, chosen for something greater than my small, lonely existence. The meeting with Charles and Margaret Whitmore took place on a Thursday afternoon in November. Their home on Lazy Lane was everything I'd imagined. A sprawling colonial with white columns, manicured gardens, and a circular driveway that could fit 6 cars. Margaret Whitmore was a thin woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and cold blue, eyes that seemed to assess my worth like I was livestock at auction. Charles Whitmore barely looked up from his newspaper when his wife introduced me. He was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and the soft hands of someone who'd never done manual labor. The living room where we sat was larger than my entire house, with crystal chandeliers and oil paintings that probably cost more than I'd made in years. "Pastor Thompson speaks very highly of you," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she had her doubts. The arrangement they proposed seemed reasonable at first. I would live in their guest house, a small but comfortable space behind the main residence, and help with light housekeeping, cooking, and occasional entertaining duties. In exchange, I would receive room and board plus a modest salary. "It's perfect for someone in your situation," Margaret explained, her voice carrying the subtle condescension of someone who'd never worried about money. Pastor Thompson was present during this meeting, nodding approvingly as the details were discussed. He sat in an ornate chair near the fireplace, his presence somehow making everything seem legitimate and blessed by God. "Sister Grace needs structure in her life," he told the Whitmores, speaking about me as if I weren't in the room. "This arrangement will be beneficial for everyone involved." What I didn't understand then was the paperwork I was signing. Pastor Thompson explained it as a service contract that would protect both parties, but the legal language was confusing and overwhelming. Margaret Whitmore watched me sign with satisfaction, while Charles finally looked up from his paper long enough to witness my signature. The pen felt heavy in my arthritic hands as I unknowingly signed away my freedom. Moving into the guest house felt like a new beginning. The space was small but clean, with a kitchenette, a bedroom, and a sitting area that looked out onto the Whitmores' perfectly maintained backyard. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I had a purpose again. Pastor Thompson helped me move my few belongings, constantly reassuring me that this was God's will for my life. The first few weeks seemed almost pleasant. My duties were light, preparing breakfast for the Whitmores, doing some dusting and vacuuming, occasionally helping Margaret prepare for her bridge club meetings. The guest house was comfortable, and I felt grateful to have a roof over my head and regular meals. I even had a small television and could tend to a flower garden that Margaret allowed me to plant. But gradually, the expectations began to change. Margaret started requesting that I work longer hours, often from dawn until well past dinner time. "Grace, I need you to polish all the silver today," she would announce at breakfast, gesturing toward cabinets full of elaborate serving pieces. "We're having the Hendersons over this weekend, and everything must be perfect." The tasks multiplied like weeds, each one more demanding than the last. Charles proved to be even more difficult than his wife. He had a violent temper that would explode without warning, usually triggered by minor imperfections in the household routine. I'll never forget the first time he screamed at me. It was over coffee that he claimed was too weak. His face turned red as he threw the cup against the kitchen wall, the expensive china shattering into pieces that I had to clean up, while he continued his tirade. When I tried to discuss my concerns with Pastor Thompson during one of his monthly visits, he dismissed my complaints with a wave of his hand. We were sitting in the guest house living room, and I could see Margaret watching us from her kitchen window. "Suffering builds character, Sister Grace," he said, his voice taking on that preaching tone. "Remember that our Lord Jesus suffered for us. This is your cross to bear." The isolation began to weigh on me heavily. I wasn't allowed to leave the property without permission, which was rarely granted. My old friends from church were told I was serving the Lord in a special capacity and couldn't be disturbed. The only contact I had with the outside world was through Pastor Thompson's monthly visits, and even those began to feel more like inspections than pastoral care. By the spring of 2009, I realized I hadn't received any of the promised salary. When I asked Margaret about it, she looked at me with genuine surprise. "Oh, Grace, didn't Pastor Thompson explain? Your wages are being held in trust for you. It's all being handled through the church." Her explanation sounded reasonable, but something in her eyes told me she was lying. The physical demands of the work began taking a toll on my aging body. My arthritis flared constantly from the repetitive cleaning motions, and my back ached from bending over to scrub floors and baseboards. Margaret seemed to take pleasure in finding fault with my work, making me redo tasks that were already perfectly adequate. "Grace, you missed a spot," became her favorite phrase. usually accompanied by a pointing finger and a disapproving frown. Sleep became elusive as anxiety consumed my thoughts. I would lie in the narrow bed in the guest house, staring at the ceiling and wondering how my life had taken such a dark turn. The sounds of the Whitmore's parties would drift across the yard. Laughter, clinking glasses, conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes, while I remained hidden away like a shameful secret. The verbal abuse escalated throughout that first year. Charles would call me names that I won't repeat, questioning my intelligence and worth as a human being. Margaret was more subtle but equally cruel, making comments about my appearance, my age, and my unfortunate circumstances. They spoke about me in front of their guests as if I were furniture, discussing my shortcomings and limitations, while I served their elaborate dinner parties. Pastor Thompson's visits became less frequent and more perfunctory. He would spend most of his time talking with the Whitmores in their main house, occasionally stopping by the guest house to deliver what felt like scripted encouragement. "You're doing God's work here, Sister Grace," he would say, but his eyes never quite met mine. I began to suspect that these visits were more about collecting payment than providing pastoral care. The breaking point came during a dinner party in the summer of 2010. I was serving dessert when I accidentally spilled a small amount of sauce on the tablecloth. Charles erupted in fury, grabbing my wrist so tightly that it left bruises for weeks. "You clumsy old woman," he shouted, his spittle hitting my face. "Can't you do anything right?" The guests sat in uncomfortable silence while I cleaned up the mess with shaking hands. That night, I sat in the guest house bathroom, examining the purple fingerprints on my wrist, and finally admitting to myself what I had become. A slave. The word felt foreign and impossible. Something from history books. Not something that could happen to an elderly woman in 21st century America. But there was no other term for my situation. I was being held against my will, forced to work without pay, and subjected to physical and emotional abuse. I began to pay closer attention to the conversations between Pastor Thompson and the Whitmores during his visits. Standing quietly in the kitchen while preparing refreshments, I caught fragments of discussions about monthly arrangements and keeping her motivated. The pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, revealing a horrifying picture of betrayal and exploitation that made my stomach turn. The realization that Pastor Thompson was being paid for my servitude hit me like a physical blow. This man I had trusted, who had spoken to me about God's love and plan for my life, had literally sold me to the highest bidder. The monthly visits weren't pastoral care. They were business meetings to collect his fee for providing the Whitmores with unpaid labor. My attempts to contact the outside world were systematically blocked. The guest house had no phone, and I wasn't allowed to use the main house telephone. When I asked about visiting my old church friends, Margaret would make excuses about my busy schedule or suggest that I was becoming too attached to worldly relationships. The isolation was complete and deliberate. The physical abuse escalated as my second year of captivity began. Charles began pushing me when he was dissatisfied with my work, and Margaret would accidentally bump into me hard enough to leave bruises. They seemed to take pleasure in my pain, as if breaking down my spirit was part of the entertainment. I felt myself disappearing, becoming a ghost in my own life. Food became another tool of control. My meals were often leftovers or scraps, and I was forbidden from eating anything without permission. I lost significant weight, my clothes hanging loose on my shrinking frame. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the hollow-eyed woman staring back at me. I was becoming invisible, which I suspect was exactly what they wanted. The psychological manipulation was perhaps worse than the physical abuse. Margaret would alternate between cruel criticism and false kindness, keeping me constantly off balance and desperate for approval. "You're so lucky we took you in, Grace," she would say after a particularly harsh day. "Where would you be without us? Probably dead in some nursing home." Her words planted seeds of doubt about my own worth and options. Pastor Thompson's betrayal cut deeper than anything the Whitmores could do to me. This was a man I had trusted with my spiritual welfare, who had held my hand during Robert's funeral and promised that God would provide for me. Instead, he had delivered me into bondage and was profiting from my suffering. The hypocrisy was staggering and soul-crushing. By 2011, I had given up hope of escape. The Whitmores had convinced me that I had nowhere else to go, no one who cared about me, and no skills valuable enough to support myself. I felt ancient and worthless, a burden that they were graciously bearing out of Christian charity. The psychological chains were stronger than any physical restraints could have been. The turning point came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, who lived in the house next door. She was a retired teacher in her 60s who had been watching my situation with growing concern. One afternoon, while I was hanging laundry in the backyard, she approached the fence that separated our properties. "Honey," she said quietly, "are you okay? I've been worried about you." Elena's kindness was like water to someone dying of thirst. She had noticed that I never seemed to leave the property, that I looked increasingly thin and tired, and that the Whitmores treated me more like property than a person. "This isn't right," she whispered, glancing toward the main house to make sure we weren't being watched. "What they're doing to you isn't legal." For the first time in years, someone was seeing me as a human being worthy of concern and respect. Elena began finding excuses to work in her garden when I was outside, offering quiet words of encouragement and slowly building my confidence. She told me about resources for elderly people in crisis, about legal aid organizations, and most importantly, about the possibility that my situation could change. The conversation that would change everything happened on a sweltering August afternoon in 2012. Elena had been watching the Whitmores leave for what appeared to be an extended trip, their car loaded with suitcase. She quickly came to the fence and pressed a cell phone into my hands. "Grace," she said urgently, "you need to call the police. What's happening to you is called human trafficking, and it's a federal crime." As I held that phone in my trembling hands, 4 years of suppressed hope and rage came flooding back. Elena's words echoed in my mind. Human trafficking, federal crime, illegal. For the first time since I'd signed those papers in the Whitmores' living room, I realized that I wasn't crazy, I wasn't worthless, and I wasn't alone. Someone had finally seen through the lies and manipulation to the truth of my situation. With Elena standing guard and my heart pounding like a drum, I dialed 911 and whispered the words that would begin my journey back to freedom. "I need help. I think I'm being held as a slave." The police officer who answered my call that August afternoon was Detective Sarah Martinez, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a voice that immediately made me feel safe. "Ma'am, I need you to stay on the line with me," she said calmly. "Can you tell me your name and where you are?" My voice was barely a whisper as I gave her the address on Lazy Lane, constantly glancing toward the main house to make sure the Whitmores hadn't returned early from their trip. Elena stood guard by the fence, her own cell phone ready to warn me if she saw the Whitmores' black Mercedes pulling into the driveway. The August heat was oppressive, but I felt cold all over as I tried to explain my situation to Detective Martinez. "I've been here for 4 years, I managed to say, my words tumbling out in a rush. "My pastor, he arranged it. I haven't been paid. I can't leave. They hurt me." Even saying the words felt surreal, like I was describing someone else's nightmare. Detective Martinez asked me questions that no one had asked in years, about my well-being, my safety, my wishes for my own life. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that what you're describing sounds like human trafficking," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You are not in trouble. You are a victim, and we're going to help you." Those words, "you are a victim," hit me like a revelation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't ungrateful. I wasn't worthless. I was a victim of a crime. Within 30 minutes, I could hear sirens in the distance. Elena squeezed my hand through the fence as 3 police cars pulled up to the Whitmore residence, their red and blue lights flashing against the pristine white columns of the house. Detective Martinez was the first to approach the guest house, her badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Mrs. Williams?" I'm Detective Martinez. You're safe now. We're here to help you. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, photographs, and medical examinations. A paramedic named James checked my vital signs and documented the fading bruises on my arms and wrists. "Ma'am, when was the last time you saw a doctor?" he asked gently. I couldn't remember. It had been years. The Whitmores had never allowed me medical care, claiming it was too expensive and unnecessary for someone my age. Detective Martinez walked through the guest house with me, taking photographs of my living conditions. The small space that had once seemed like a blessing now looked like what it truly was, a prison cell disguised as accommodation. She photographed the single bed with its thin mattress, the tiny kitchenette with its empty refrigerator, and the bathroom with its cracked mirror that had reflected my despair for so many years. The most difficult part was explaining about Pastor Thompson. Detective Martinez listened without judgment as I described how he had gained my trust, arranged my placement with the Whitmores, and collected monthly payments for my services. "This is a complex case involving religious authority and elder abuse," she explained. "But I want you to know that what he did is absolutely criminal. He exploited your faith and your vulnerability." Elena proved to be a crucial witness. She had been documenting my situation for months, taking photographs from her yard that showed me working at all hours, looking increasingly frail and isolated. "I knew something was wrong," she told Detective Martinez. "Grace never left the property, never had visitors except for that pastor, and she looked more scared and thin every time I saw her. I should have called sooner." The Whitmores returned from their trip that evening to find their home surrounded by police cars and crime scene tape. I watched from the safety of Detective Martinez's patrol car as Charles and Margaret were led away in handcuffs, their faces showing shock and indignation rather than remorse. "This is ridiculous," Margaret shouted. "She was an employee. We gave her a place to live." But the evidence told a different story. That first night of freedom, I stayed in a safe house run by a non-profit organization that helped trafficking victims. The room was simple but clean, with a real bed, a television I could control, and most importantly, a door I could lock from the inside. I lay awake most of the night, afraid that I would wake up back in the guest house, that this rescue had all been a dream. The investigation into Pastor Thompson began immediately. Detective Martinez explained that religious leaders who exploit their congregations often have multiple victims, and they wanted to make sure I wasn't his only target. Federal agents raided the Blessed Hope Baptist Church on Westheimer Road, seizing financial records and computer files that would reveal the full extent of his criminal enterprise. The evidence against Pastor Thompson was overwhelming. Bank records showed monthly payments from the Whitmores to an account he controlled, totaling over $40,000 during my 4 years of captivity. He had been advertising my services to other wealthy families, describing me as a devoted Christian woman willing to serve, while pocketing the fees and keeping me isolated from anyone who might help me escape. My first meeting with the federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Chen, took place in September of 2012. She was a sharp woman in her 30s who specialized in human trafficking cases. "Mrs. Williams, what happened to you represents one of the most clear-cut cases of trafficking I've seen," she told me. "We're going to make sure everyone involved faces the full consequences of their actions." The medical examination revealed the full extent of the damage done to my body during those 4 years. I had developed severe arthritis from the repetitive cleaning motions. My blood pressure was dangerously high from stress and poor nutrition, and I showed signs of chronic malnutrition. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the physician who examined me, was visibly angry as she documented each health issue. "This is systematic abuse of an elderly person," she said. "It's unconscionable." The psychological evaluation was even more revealing. Dr. Michael Torres, a specialist in trauma therapy, explained that I was suffering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition common among trafficking victims. "You've been subjected to systematic psychological manipulation designed to break down your sense of self-worth and independence," he explained. Recovery will take time, but it is absolutely possible. Pastor Thompson was arrested on a Tuesday morning in October while preparing for his weekly sermon. I wasn't there to see it, but Detective Martinez described how he maintained his innocence, even as federal agents led him away in handcuffs. He kept saying he was doing God's work, she told me. Right up until the moment they put him in the patrol car, he was claiming he was helping you by giving you purpose and structure. The news of the arrests made headlines throughout Houston. Local pastor charged in human trafficking scheme. Read the front page of the Houston Chronicle. Reporters tried to interview me, but my legal team protected my privacy while the case was pending. I wasn't ready to face the public scrutiny, still struggling to understand how I had become the victim of such an elaborate deception. Other victims began coming forward as news of the case spread. 3 other elderly women from Pastor Thompson's congregation had been placed in similar situations with wealthy families around Houston. Like me, they had been isolated, unpaid, and subjected to abuse, while Pastor Thompson collected fees for their services. The scope of his criminal enterprise was staggering. The Blessed Hope Baptist Church was closed permanently, its assets seized to help compensate the victims. Walking past the empty building months later, I felt a complex mix of emotions. This place had once represented hope and community to me, but it had been corrupted by one man's greed and manipulation. The for sale sign in the parking lot seemed like a fitting end to a chapter of deception. The legal proceedings moved slowly through the federal court system. Charles and Margaret Whitmore were charged with conspiracy to commit human trafficking, forced labor, and elder abuse. Their defense attorneys tried to argue that they believed I was a willing employee, but the evidence of abuse and the lack of payment made their claims impossible to sustain. Pastor Thompson's trial began in the spring of 2013. Testifying against him was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. Sitting in that federal courtroom, looking at the man who had betrayed my trust so completely, I felt a mixture of fear, anger, and sadness. He sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, still projecting the authority and confidence that had once made me trust him completely. My testimony lasted 2 full days. I described how Pastor Thompson had gained my trust during my most vulnerable period, how he had arranged my placement with the Whitmores, and how he had dismissed my complaints during his monthly visits. The prosecutor, Ms. Chen, guided me through the details with patience and respect, making sure the jury understood the systematic nature of the exploitation. The defense attorney tried to portray me as a willing participant who had simply changed her mind about the arrangement. "Mrs. Williams, didn't you sign a contract agreeing to work for the Whitmores?" he asked during cross-examination. But Ms. Chen had prepared me for this line of questioning. I signed papers I didn't understand, trusting a man I believed was a servant of God, I replied. I was deceived about what I was agreeing to. The most powerful moment of the trial came when the prosecutor played recordings of phone calls between Pastor Thompson and Charles Whitmore. The FBI had obtained warrants to tap their phones during the investigation, and the conversations revealed the cold, business-like nature of their relationship. "She's getting a bit difficult," Charles could be heard saying. "You need to remind her of her place." Pastor Thompson's response was chilling. "Don't worry. I'll handle her during my next visit." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Pastor Thompson showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Justice was finally being served, not just for me, but for all the elderly people who had been victimized by his scheme. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold February morning in 2014. I had prepared a victim impact statement, my chance to tell Pastor Thompson and the court how his actions had affected my life. Standing at the podium in that federal courtroom, I looked directly at the man who had stolen 4 years of my life and spoke from my heart about the betrayal, the abuse, and the long road to recovery. "Your Honor," I said, my voice stronger than I had expected, "Pastor Thompson didn't just steal my labor and my freedom. He stole my faith in humanity, my trust in religious authority, and my belief in my own worth as a human being. He took a grieving widow who was seeking comfort in God's house and turned her into a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. The courtroom was silent as I spoke, and I could see some jurors wiping away tears. Judge Patricia Morrison sentenced Pastor Thompson to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice filled with disgust, "you have violated every principle of the faith you claim to represent. You preyed upon vulnerable elderly people who trusted you with their spiritual welfare, and you turned that trust into profit. Your actions represent a particularly heinous form of elder abuse and human trafficking." Charles and Margaret Whitmore received sentences of 8 and 6 years respectively. Their defense attorneys had negotiated plea agreements in exchange for their cooperation in the case against Pastor Thompson. But Judge Morrison made it clear that their sentences reflected the seriousness of their crimes. "You treated Mrs. Williams like property rather than a human being," she told them. "Your wealth and social status make your actions even more reprehensible." The civil lawsuit that followed resulted in a settlement that provided financial compensation for my suffering and medical expenses. The money couldn't give me back those 4 lost years, but it did provide security for my remaining years and resources to help other trafficking victims. I donated a significant portion to organizations that help elderly people avoid exploitation and abuse. Recovery was a long and difficult process. Dr. Torres worked with me for over 2 years, helping me rebuild my sense of self-worth and independence. "You survived something that would have broken many people," he told me during one of our sessions. "Your strength and resilience are remarkable. Learning to trust again, to make my own decisions, and to believe in my own value took time and patience." Elena Rodriguez became one of my closest friends, the sister I never had. She had risked her own safety to help me, and her courage had literally saved my life. We would sit in her garden on Sunday afternoons, drinking iced tea and talking about everything except the past. She helped me remember what normal human relationships looked like, what kindness without ulterior motives felt like. Finding a new place to live was both exciting and terrifying. After years of having every decision made for me, choosing my own apartment, my own furniture, even my own groceries felt overwhelming. But with the help of a social worker named Maria Santos, I slowly learned to navigate independence again. The small apartment in Dallas became my sanctuary, a place where I was safe and free. I began volunteering with the Texas Human Trafficking Task Force, sharing my story with law enforcement officers, social workers, and other professionals who work with trafficking victims. Speaking publicly about my experience was difficult at first, but I realized that my story could help others recognize the signs of trafficking and exploitation, particularly among elderly victims who are often overlooked. The most healing moment came when I received a letter from another elderly woman who had heard my story and recognized similar patterns in her own situation. She had been placed with a family by her nephew, who was collecting payments while she worked without compensation. My testimony had given her the courage to contact authorities, and she was rescued before suffering years of abuse like I had. On the 5th anniversary of my rescue, Detective Martinez visited me in my Dallas apartment. She had been promoted to sergeant and was leading a specialized unit focused on elder abuse and trafficking. "Grace, I want you to know that your case changed how we investigate these crimes," she told me. "Your courage in coming forward has helped us save dozens of other victims." I never returned to organized religion after my experience with Pastor Thompson, but I didn't lose my faith entirely. Instead, I found God in the kindness of strangers like Elena, in the dedication of professionals like Detective Martinez and Dr. Torres, and in my own strength to survive and rebuild. My relationship with the divine became personal and private, no longer mediated by human authorities who might exploit it. The nightmares gradually faded, replaced by dreams of the future rather than memories of the past. I began traveling, something I had never been able to do during my marriage or my years of captivity. I visited my sister in California, took a cruise to Alaska, and even flew to Washington, D.C. to speak at a conference on human trafficking. Each trip was a declaration of my freedom and independence. Now at 75, I live quietly but purposefully. My small apartment is filled with plants, books, and photographs of the new friends I've made and the places I've visited. I have a cat named Freedom who keeps me company, and I volunteer at a local senior center where I help other elderly people navigate social services and avoid scams and exploitation. As I finish telling this story, I want people to understand that human trafficking doesn't always look like what you see in movies. It can happen to anyone. A grieving widow seeking comfort in church, an elderly person struggling with finances, someone who trusts the wrong person at the wrong time. But I also want people to know that survival is possible, that justice can be served, and that even after the darkest experiences, it's possible to rebuild a life of dignity and purpose. My name is Grace Williams. I am a survivor, and I am finally, truly free. This was another incredible story from our channel. Life teaches us that it's never too late for justice, revenge, or redemption. Each story you heard here is real, lived by people who found strength when everyone thought they were defeated. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and tell us in the comments, what would you have done in this situation? Your opinion matters to us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you don't miss any of our emotional stories. We have new tales of courage, revenge, and overcoming every week. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to fight for what's right. Sometimes the best revenge is living well and proving that age is just a number. Thank you for being part of our community. Until the next story, remember, every ending can be a new beginning. Subscribe, like, and comment. See you in the next video.